All right, I'll get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's installment of the High Elevation 5-Needle White Pine Science and Management webinar series. My name is Tia Rautu, and I'm a master's student at Montana State University, co-organizing this webinar series with Laurel Sindewald from UC Denver and Vlad Kovalenko from University of Montana. If you missed any previous webinars and would like to watch them, you can find recordings of all webinars on the Whitebark Flicks YouTube channel, which the link for is now in the chat. We'll start off this webinar by first introducing Julie Shamhart to give an update on the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. Julie became the executive director of the foundation in January of 2023 and previously worked as the operations manager for 8 years. Prior to her work with the foundation, Julie was an elk research technician for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for 5 years, as well as a field technician for many years on projects ranging from lichen to grizzly bears. Julie has a master's degree in natural resources from the University of Hampshire and bachelor's degrees in ecology and public relations. She enjoys running, biking, hiking, and skiing among the high elevation 5-needle pines. And with that, I'll hand it over to Julie.
Thanks, Dale. And thanks everyone for being here today. I just wanted to welcome everyone and kind of give people ideas on how they could get more involved in the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation work if you're interested in becoming more involved. So just started out by thanking our webinar organizers. These folks are all volunteers for the foundation, and they organize the webinars, get the speakers lined up, do that kind of work. So if you're a student and you're interested in that, definitely get in touch with someone on our webinar team. And we have webinar organizers lined up for next year, but in the future, there'll be opportunities for that. Let's see. We are going to be looking for new board members for the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation this spring, and then we'll be starting next fall. So if you're interested in being a board member, you don't have to be a Whitebark Pine expert. We need all kinds of folks. If you're an educator, business person, an artist, writer, all kinds of different people that would be great to contribute on the board. So get in touch with me or one of our current board members. You can find those folks on the website. We have lots of openings in our committees, particularly our ski committee and our education committee are needing people to join those committees. Our ski committee, they work on our Whitebark Pine Friendly Ski Area certifications. And we try to reach out to different ski areas that have whitebark pine in their ski area and try to encourage them to become whitebark pine friendly. So if you're interested in doing that, we certainly need more people on board to help with that committee and also to be ski area ambassadors. So if you don't want to be on a committee, just to reach out to your local ski area. We have quite a few folks here in the Northern Rockies, but we can definitely use folks spread out all across the whitebark pine habitat range in Canada and the United States to reach out to ski area management at your local ski area and encourage them to become whitebark pine friendly. Let's see. And if you're interested in getting on the field, we have a new community science project with the Pacific Crest Trail Association. So you can find out about that on our website as well. Get out there and identify whitebark pine along the Pacific Crest Trail and use iNaturalist to record some data there. And then even if you just have photos or art or things that you want to contribute to our website or to our newsletter, we're always looking for stuff like that. So reach out to me with that kind of thing. And if you are interested in leading a hike, tabling, giving presentations, if you have any sort of whitebark pine expertise or any of the high five pine that you are knowledgeable about, we would love to support you in that. And then we're always encouraging people to become members to spread the word about whitebark pine and the other high five pines. Get a t-shirt or a hat, wear those out in the public, and then just let people know what it means and why whitebark pine's important. Why are these other high pines are important? And sign up for our email newsletter and spread that to other folks that may not know about the issue. So yeah, reach out to any of us, check out our website, and yeah, we'd love folks to get more involved. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Julie, for the update. It is my pleasure to now introduce today's speaker, Vlad Kovalenko, who is a master's student in systems ecology at the University of Montana. Vlad is studying how the decline of whitebark pine affects the population of Clark's Nutcracker in Glacier National Park. Vlad is interested in modeling Nutcracker abundance and occupancy using in-person surveys, acoustic monitoring, and Bayesian statistics. He loves the elegance of this bird-pine mutualism while getting to spend time in the alpine. Vlad plans to complete his graduate degree this spring and further pursue a research career or PhD program. If you have any questions during Vlad's talk, you are welcome to type them in the chat and I will read them aloud at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Vlad.
Awesome. Thank you, Tia. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Let me just share my other screen here. Are you seeing my title slide here?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. I am really thrilled and honored to present to this audience. It's been really cool to help coordinate this webinar series, and now to actually get to present at it is really a treat. So thank you for joining me today. Today, I'll be telling you about my master's thesis project, quantifying the drivers of whitebark pine decline and Clark's Nutcracker habitat use in Glacier National Park. I'd like to start by recognizing my graduate committee and co-authors on this project, my supervisor, Lisa Bate, committee members, Vicki Dreitz and Karen Nelson, Diana Six, my committee chair and faculty advisor, and Jeff Doser, who is a modeler and statistician and has helped me a lot with the mathematical side of things for this project. First, I would like to also acknowledge that all of this research took place on the traditional lands of the Blackfeet, Kootenai, and Salish peoples, and I feel extremely privileged and lucky to have gotten to do my master's study in this sacred place. So just a quick overview of what I'll be talking to you about today. I'll start off with an introduction to the study and move into the abiotic drivers of whitebark pine mortality, disease, cone production, and regeneration, and then move into the Nutcracker side of things with how the birds are responding to those whitebark pine characteristics. And then we'll conclude with the big takeaways. And here on the right is an area of our study, or a map of our study area, Glacier National Park, and the little purple dots correspond to the locations of our study sites. And so this will be a review for many of you, but for anyone who isn't already familiar with whitebark pine, it is related to all other 5 needle pines, including limber pine, sugar pine, foxtail, bristlecone, as well as eastern and western white pine. And it is known as the only stone pine in America, which refers to its large wingless seeds. It's a very long-lived species. Individuals can reach several hundred years of age, with the oldest known tree being older than 1,270 years old. And in places where whitebark pine is prominent, it essentially defines where tree line is. And most other species of trees cannot really establish on their own in these environments. And this is why whitebark pine is known as a foundation species. That it's typically first to establish at these elevations on steep barren slopes with really poor soils, or as you can see in the photo here on the right, talus fields. And then once it does establish, it stabilizes the soil and creates conditions that are more amenable to the presence of other plant and tree species, as well as wildlife. And that is what makes it a keystone species, because all those other members of its community are reliant on Whitebark's ecosystem services to be able to survive there. Unfortunately, Whitebark pine is in steep decline in many parts of its range. It's got a number of stressors throughout its range that are diminishing its numbers, and so much so that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recently listed this tree as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And furthermore, Whitebark pine is known to be dependent on Clark's Nutcracker for seed dispersal, and there's not any other known effective vector for Whitebark pine regeneration. And so amongst the many stressors that Whitebark pine faces, the one specific to our ecosystem is white pine blister rust. It is an exotic fungal pathogen that was accidentally introduced into North America in the early 1900s and was first discovered in whitebark pine in 1926. It has a really interesting and complex life cycle. And I want to emphasize that, like many fungi, this organism requires high relative humidity and moisture and cool temperatures. And just to quickly give you an overview of this life cycle, beginning in the spring, spores of this fungus are produced on the bark of infected trees and then are dispersed to alternate hosts via the wind. Alternate hosts are typically shrubs in the family ribes. And throughout the summer, the disease increases and intensifies in the ribes. And then in late summer, new airborne spores are produced on the leaves of ribes that are then transported via the wind to uninfected white pines, where they enter the needles and progress slowly through the branches and to the main stem of the tree, eventually leading to its death. Depending on the size of the tree, that can take anywhere from several weeks for small seedlings to several decades for mature trees. And previous research has shown that the most delicate and kind of critical periods of this pathogen's life cycle are the spring and late summer, when it is in that airborne dispersal stage. And so taking a look at findings on Glacier's whitebark pine, white pine blister rust has led to severe mortality and infection rates. The last study which occurred about 15 years ago estimated that 47% of Glacier's whitebark pine had been killed, while 67% of the remaining live trees were infected with rust. And I also want to emphasize that there are other stressors, not specific to Glacier at the moment. However, my advisor, Diana Six, found that trees that are infected with rust were more vulnerable to beetle attack. They are also much less competitive against other conifers, where they do have to compete with those in cereal communities. And all of these impacts stand to be exacerbated by climate change, with drought stress weakening the trees, as well as warmer climate expanding the range and survivability of mountain pine beetles. And so to take a look at some previous work that has looked at the abiotic influences on blister rust infection, first we'll start with this study by Smith and Hoffman in 2001, who were looking at whitebark pine blister rust infection in southern Idaho and western Wyoming. And they found that the most important predictors of infection were elevation, average tree diameter, and mean summer precipitation. And specifically, they found that whitebark pine that were lower down in elevation and had bigger diameters were more likely to be infected, particularly in areas that received more summer precipitation. Then in 2014, Kearns and others were looking at white pine blister rust infection in limber pine in Colorado and southern Wyoming. And they found the most important drivers of infection there were May relative humidity, minimum temperature, and precipitation. So specifically the climatic conditions in the springtime when infected trees pass the disease on to ribes. Conversely, in 2019, Dave Tama and others were studying white pine blister rust infection in The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem found that late summer, early fall conditions were more important, and specifically the interaction of temperature and relative humidity. And as we can see from this figure, at those lower temperatures and higher relative humidities, the probability of infection in whitebark pine is greatest, and specifically in those larger diameter individuals. And so that motivated my study questions for this chapter. First, I asked, what is the current status of whitebark pine in Glacier? And I specifically wanted to update the mortality and incidence metrics. And then I asked, what are the landscape and climate drivers of white pine blister rust mortality and infection, as well as what drives cone production and regeneration in whitebark pine. To do this, I established 30 whitebark pine forest monitoring plots throughout Glacier National Park, borrowing methods from my supervisor, Lisa Bate. Basically, each of the 30 plots I established consisted of 4 50 by 20 meter transects, within which I inventoried and measured the diameters of all standing, live, and dead whitebark pines. I also counted whitebark pine cones on all those trees. Also within these peach-colored subplots, I measured the dead down whitebark pines. And within the dark green-colored subplots, I inventoried all the whitebark pine seedlings. In addition to all of that, I inventoried and assessed blister rust incidence and severity on all living whitebark pines in these plots. And I used methods developed by my advisor, Diana Six, which basically entails dividing the tree into thirds, both for the crown and the bole, and giving each of those thirds a rating from 0 to 3, with 0 being uninfected and 3 being greater than 50% infected. Then to analyze these data, I created separate models for the landscape and the climate variables in order to predict the rust mortality, infection, and cone production. The landscape variables I used were recorded in the field, and those were aspect, elevation, latitude, and longitude. And then the climate variables I queried using the DAMET dataset, which is a model-derived dataset of climatic conditions that is compiled from ground observed weather stations at a 1 square kilometer resolution. And then in order to model mortality, infection, and cone production, I created binomially distributed generalized linear mixed models, and I used plot as a random variable to account for spatial autocorrelation. And then to model the seedling count at my sites, I created a Poisson distributed generalized linear model. And so getting into the results, here's a slide showing kind of the demographics of whitebark pine in Glacier. As you can see, for the 4 categories of whitebark that I have here, live trees, dead down whitebark pine, and then infected trees, all of these categories are dominated by saplings between 0 and 20 centimeters DBH. And so that is our main demographic in Glacier, and unfortunately, mature trees are pretty few and far between in our study area. And so to look at the current mortality and incidence, here's a table showing the results of my study there at the top, along with the results of other recent work looking at whitebark pine in Glacier. And as you can see, my mortality estimate is 69.3% of whitebark pine in the park, which is quite a jump from previous estimates, the one most recent by Cindy Smith and others, which estimated 46.5%. And a big part of that is the fact that I did count those dead down individuals. That definitely increases the estimate, considering that those other studies did not count those individuals. However, if I had conformed to their protocols and only counted standing dead trees, my estimate of mortality would have been 53.6%. So still an increase from 15 years ago. And then looking at rust incidence, my estimate of 65.2% of individuals infected is roughly in line with the previous estimates. And then here I wanted to show you a figure detailing the distribution and severity of blister rust infection within individuals at my study sites. So on the left, we have mean crown infection severity, and on the right, we have the mean boll infection severity, with the three colors corresponding to the 3/3 of each of those parts of the tree. And as you can see here, blister rust is very well established in Glacier National Park, with the exception of a handful of relatively healthy sites. It's very ubiquitous throughout. I did not have any sites that were not infected with blister rust, and there doesn't appear to be much of a geographic pattern to the infection. Moving on to the effect of whitebark pine diameter, which has been found to be important in previous studies. I just wanted to show how whitebark pine diameter does affect these different response variables that I was interested in looking at. And so here we can see across the board that the size of the tree affects the probability that it's alive, that it's infected, and that it produces cones. And we can see that the largest individuals are the least likely to be alive, the most likely to be infected, and they're also the ones that are most likely to produce cones. And so that's a troubling outlook for whitebark pine in Glacier. So moving on to what influences the probability that a whitebark pine is alive. My models found that longitude, spring relative humidity, and late summer snow water equivalent were the most important predictors. For longitude, we found that trees further east in our study areas were the least likely to be alive, and that trees just west of the Continental Divide, as well as at sites just east of the Continental Divide, were the most likely to be alive. Also, sites that have higher spring relative humidity showed lower percentages of live trees, particularly in saplings. Mature trees did not have as strong of a response. And then lastly, late summer snow water equivalent actually had a positive impact on the likelihood, on the probability that whitebark pine were alive, with sites that had more early snow corresponding to more live trees. So moving on to the probability that whitebark pine were infected. Here we found aspect, elevation, and again, late summer snow water equivalent be the most important predictors. For aspect, we found particularly seedlings and saplings on west-facing stands were less likely to be, or less probable to be infected than their counterparts on other aspects. Also, we found that trees higher up in elevation were less likely to be infected. And again, trees in sites that experience more early snowfall were also less likely to be infected. And I think the mechanism behind that is that snow actually forms a physical barrier between the infected ribes shrubs and the uninfected whitebark pines, thus making it harder for those wind-borne spores to infect the new trees. Moving on to the probability of cone production. Again, aspect was important, with south-facing whitebark pines being more likely to produce cones. Elevation and late summer snow water equivalent were also important, except this time they had the opposite effect. Trees that were higher up and had more snowfall in the late summer were less likely to produce cones. And I think that's an effect of the shorter growing season. And then down here at the bottom, I wanted to sort of see how the different intensity and severity of blister rust infection in different parts of the crown and boll affected cone production, as it's been mentioned to do in previous work. And sure enough, we found that crown kill in the top third of the tree, as well as boll kill in the top third of the tree, were the most important infection variables for affecting cone production. Finally, for the models that predicted seedling counts in our plots, found that aspect was an important predictor, with most seedlings occurring on west-facing slopes. Also, we found there to be more seedlings in further north and west in the park. Additionally, spring shortwave radiation in the form of sunlight had a positive relationship with seedling counts, while spring relative humidity had a negative effect on seedlings. And I think that may be an effect of increased rust or more amenable conditions for rust production. And then lastly, late summer relative humidity had a weak positive effect on the seedling counts in my plots. And so what are the takeaways from this chapter? Unfortunately, whitebark pine is doing significantly worse in Glacier than previously estimated. And unfortunately, the mature trees are bearing the brunt of that decline. The places that they are doing better are higher up and closer to the continental divide. They're doing better on west-facing slopes, as well as in places with low spring humidity and early snowfall. And also, I think for resource managers and considering restoration strategies for these trees in the park, they should consider the trade-off between sites that are higher up and receive that early snowfall, having better chances of survival and lower infection rates. However, they do also produce fewer cones. And so looking at planting whitebark pine seedlings, if managers are confident that those seedlings are rust resistant and are not trying to prioritize lower infection rates, then perhaps planting them lower down where that growing season is longer would maximize their probability to produce cones. However, if they are still concerned with keeping those trees uninfected, then maybe higher up in snowier areas is the better place to plant. And additionally, managers should consider that climate change may be altering some of these climatic patterns that we see. And so if they're planting trees in places where they're banking on the snowpack to keep the blister rust off the uninfected individuals, they may consider the fact that that snowfall may shift to rain in the future, which might actually reverse that positive effect and be more of a enabling, better enable blister rust spread. So now moving into chapter 3, we'll start with the Clark's Nutcracker. Again, sorry for anyone who this is a review for, but for anyone who's not familiar, Clark's Nutcrackers are members of the corvid family, so they're related to jays, ravens, and crows, and they're about the same size and shape as a crow. However, they're the only bird native to North America from the genus Nucifraga. These birds typically occupy conifer forests that are dominated by whitebark pine at higher elevations, as well as ponderosa pine and limber pine lower down. And they rely largely on the seeds of these trees for food, but they also eat insects and opportunistic food items. The Clark's Nutcracker is also the only bird native to North America that has a sublingual pouch, and that allows it to transport up to 100 whitebark pine seeds to caches throughout its home range. These caches typically contain between 1 and 15 seeds, and a single bird may cache as many as 100,000 pine seeds in the cone harvest season on a good whitebark pine cone year. They have an amazing spatial memory, which allows them to remember the locations of their caches for as long as 285 days. And retrieving these caches throughout winter and spring enables them to feed themselves and also their young. And so Clark's Nutcrackers and whitebark pine are considered mutualists. Whitebark pine is considered the obligate mutualist because Clark's Nutcracker is the only known effective disperser of its seeds. However, as I mentioned before, nutcrackers do have other food sources, and so they're considered facultative mutualists of whitebark pines. And I think these two range maps on the right really illustrate that well, with Clark's nutcracker occupying many areas in which whitebark pine is not found. And research has shown that at low cone densities, nutcrackers can actually abandon those whitebark pine stands. Additionally, other research has shown that in those low density stands, nutcrackers may consume all the cones or all the seeds, thus shifting from mutualists to parasites. And so looking at some recent findings of nutcracker studies, a really big landmark whitebark pine paper in 2009 by McKinney and others found that there is actually a threshold effect of cone production, resulting in low nutcracker occurrence probability when the cone density falls below roughly 1,000 cones per hectare, which they equated to about 5 square meters of live whitebark pine basal area per hectare. In 2012, Behringer and others tested this model in their study in Glacier as well as Grand Teton National Parks and found that the McKinney model slightly underpredicted nutcrackers in their system, and they actually reduced the live whitebark pine basal area cutoff to 2 square meters per hectare. And then a few years ago, Shamming and Sutherland tested both these models in their study of nutcrackers in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and found that both of them underpredicted nutcracker occurrence in their system. More recently, Ray and others who were looking at the population trends of different bird species in Pacific Northwest national parks found evidence that nutcrackers were declining, albeit slightly. And as you can see by the width of this confidence interval, that is actually pretty hard to ascertain for sure what's happening there. And then in 2020, they were looking at some of the habitat covariates that might be influencing nutcracker populations throughout parks in the Pacific West. And they found that in Mount Rainier National Park, nutcrackers were declining concurrently with an increase in whitebark pine crown kill related to blister rust. However, in looking at the same variables in North Cascades National Park, they were not able to find such a clear trend. There's a lot of variability in those data. Again, in 2020, Shamming and Sutherland found that the presence of cones in a stand was a more important determinant of nutcracker occurrence probability than cone density. And I don't know if you can see the gray confidence intervals there, but variability of nutcracker use increased with the amount of cones. And then they also found that the area of whitebark pine on the landscape was a positive driver of nutcracker occurrence. And then most recently, last year, Tom McLaren, who was looking at nutcracker density in Yellowstone National Park, found that nutcrackers were consistently present in higher densities in whitebark pine stands as opposed to other forest types. And that was occurring throughout the cone harvest season and was particularly pronounced in the mid-cone harvest season. And so that helped me motivate my study questions for this chapter. First, I asked, how are nutcrackers responding to whitebark pine forest characteristics in Glacier? And I also wanted to compare how 2 models based on 2 different survey techniques estimated the relative importances of habitat covariates. And so to answer these questions, first, we captured 8 Clark's nutcrackers and outfitted them with satellite transmitters that allows us to track their movements. We had many questions we wanted to ask of these transmitted birds, including where they spend their time during the summer, whether or not they migrate from our ecosystem in the fall, and whether or not they're breeding in the spring. However, due to some technical difficulties, namely a lack of sunshine in the winter months in our ecosystem, as well as 2 bird mortalities, we were not able to answer all of those questions. However, we did get some useful and interesting data out of those. Then for 3 summers, we went out to all 30 of our plots and did point count surveys at each plot center at least 2 to 4 times per harvest season, which in Glacier National Park is from late July through the end of September, based on our field observations. And we counted all birds that were using the stand that we were in, and we made sure that we didn't include birds that were simply flying through or vocalizing somewhere off in the distance. Additionally, at 20 of these sites, we deployed Cornell Swift automated acoustic recording units that listened continuously and daily for Clark's Nutcracker vocalizations throughout those harvest seasons. And so a little bit more about that methodology. We chose to use these acoustic monitors because they offer higher temporal resolution across sites. And basically, compared to a point count, which lasts 10 minutes and occurs 4 times at one of our sites over the two plus months of the cone harvest season, these units were recording audio 11 hours a day, every day for that time period. And so that makes that larger sample size is more amenable to estimating habitat covariate parameters with higher precision. Of course, like any methodology, it has its drawbacks. These units they're not free, and so we did have to spend money on buying them, as well as the batteries and memory cards that they require. And it does involve hiking with more weight and returning to these sites to swap batteries and memory cards. And then, of course, processing the data, identifying the Nutcracker vocalizations, and then building a whole separate set of models is also more work. And then further, these units obviously do not detect non-vocalizing individuals. And so that is one arena where having someone out in the field is definitely an advantage. And of course, like all technology, there are technical difficulties, and we definitely had our share of those, particularly in the last season when batteries were not lasting as long as we expected them to, and internal clocks were being reset. So we had to hike out with some laptops here and there to fix those issues. So getting into the analysis of all these data, first I took those solar transmitter location data and built harvest season home range estimates for 3 of our birds over 2 cone harvest seasons. For the point count data, I fit a spatial occupancy model designed by my co-author Jeff Doser, which used those probability of occurrences and related them to habitat variables. Also, that model has an equation that accounts for imperfect detection, which is the probability that a bird was available for detection and was detected by the observer, which the inverse of that is that there are birds available for detection, however, they were missed. And then for the acoustic data, first I fed all the raw audio files through BirdNet Analyzer, which is a machine learning algorithm that can identify birds by species using their vocalizations. And I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with what a nutcracker sounds like, but for those of you who aren't, here's a little sound bite. And I thought this species was an ideal candidate for such an algorithm because nothing in the environment really sounds like that. So taking all those daily nutcracker vocalization counts at each site, I fit a generalized linear mix model, also developed by my co-author Jeff Doser, to model nutcracker vocalization abundance as a function of those habitat covariates. And so moving into the results, here we have a figure looking at the 3 birds' home ranges over 2 harvest seasons, 2021 and 2022. And we can see that bird 445's home range increased in 2022. Bird 450's home range stayed roughly the same, and bird 451's home range decreased quite a bit. And so previous work has related nutcracker home range size to cone crops, and Tazashemi actually showed that on higher cone years for whitebark pine, bird home ranges were smaller, presumably because they didn't have to move around as much to find the food that they needed. And so we wanted to look at that with this study as well. And we found that specific to this drainage, the cone counts at our plots were a lot higher in 2021 than in 2022. And so bird 445 conformed to that finding, and its home range did increase on a lower cone year. However, bird 450 and 451 did not conform to that. So unfortunately, we can't really say how cone crop affects home ranges of birds in our study. Moving on to the Nutcracker occupancy model that was fit using the point count data. Here on the left, we see the occurrence probabilities for nutcrackers at all 30 of our sites, with 3 colors corresponding to the different years of the study. And then on the right are the estimates for overall occurrence probability across all sites for the 3 years. And as you can see, especially here on the right, that even though the model did have different estimates of occurrence probability across years, the really wide confidence intervals show that there's not a statistically significant difference. And so we can't really infer that there was a year-to-year change in the occurrence probability. And then on the left, as you can see, despite our estimates of different occurrence probabilities at the sites, the confidence intervals are really wide. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in those estimates. And moving on to the vocalization abundance model results. Here you can see on the left are the expected number of vocalizations by site, and year again on the right across all sites. And as you can see here, the relative size of those credible intervals is a lot smaller, with the exception of that topmost site, which had a lot of variability day to day in the vocalization number. And as well on the right, you can see that we still can't really say what the trend is year to year, because those confidence intervals do overlap quite a bit. And so since we can't compare directly these 2 results, it's like looking at apples and oranges. However, I still thought it would be interesting to see how whether there was any kind of a relationship between the predicted occurrence and the vocalization abundance. And sure enough, there is a positive association between those 2 across sites, and they are weakly correlated. But one thing that we can compare from these 2 models are the results of the covariate estimates. And so for the occurrence model, here we have the estimated effect sizes for the different variables that I measured. And we can see that live tree diameter is the most important to nutcracker occurrence according to this model, followed by cone density and live basal area. And here we have the effect curves for cone density and tree diameter. And we see that they do have those positive effects. However, as we saw in those previous studies, those credible intervals are really wide. And so there's not as much certainty in what's happening because of the small sample size. However, when we look at the vocalization abundance model, we see that those effect estimates are a bit more precise. And we see that cone density in this model was the most important, followed by live tree diameter. And for looking at those effects curves, we see here that there's no ambiguity in even those confidence intervals. They are both very clearly positive effects. So what did we gather from this chapter? We found that Clark's nutcracker habitat use was highly dependent on cone crop, as well as the diameter of whitebark pines in the site. And unlike those previous studies, which are highly cited in restoration strategies for whitebark pine, we did not find a threshold effect for cone density or area. And then as far as evaluating efficacy of point count occupancy modeling versus ARU abundance modeling, we found that while the ARU side of things is a lot more intensive in time and money, it does lead to more precise parameter estimates. And after having made that initial investment and learn how to work with these data, I think it is an asset going forward and can improve our understanding of nutcracker habitat use in Glacier. And so I would recommend continuing to study nutcrackers using acoustic monitors in the park. And hopefully over time we can detect more precise trend estimates for these birds. And so the big takeaways from this study, unfortunately, due to the steep decline of whitebark pine, we are at risk of losing those high elevation communities that it facilitates, as well as the vital ecosystem services that it provides. And this study shows that landscape and climate variables do affect those whitebark pine characteristics and should be considered when attempting to restore this species. We also found that nutcrackers are heavily, their habitat use is heavily driven by cone production and the presence of large whitebark pines at sites. And so I would say, if you were to take away one thing only from this talk, it's that we must find a way to protect those extant live, large whitebark pines, especially considering that the eminent restoration strategy calls for the planting of rust-resistant seedlings. Those trees will take anywhere from 30 to 100 years to reach cone production maturity. And in that time period, we have to find a way to keep the birds in this ecosystem. And I think if we are able to protect those old growth, mature whitebark pines that we still do have, that will be the way forward. And so to wrap things up, I'd like to thank everyone who's helped me with this project. Huge thanks to my advisor, Diana Six, for taking me on in this project and helping me to become a better writer and scientist. Thank you so much to my supervisor, Lisa Bate, for hiring me and being a mentor to me over the years in Glacier. And thanks to Kara, Vicky, and Jeff for being wonderful co-authors and for improving the quality of the work. Huge thanks to my family and friends, everyone who's always supported me, my field technicians, and all the volunteers on this project that really made working in Glacier easier and just such a pleasure, as well as all the park staff that made this project possible, everyone who helped with permitting and site selection, and then of course all my fellow grad students who were with me through this and looked at all my drafts of all my work and helped me with data analysis. And then finally, of course, I'd like to thank the funding sources for this project, the National Park Service and the Glacier National Park Conservancy. And with that, I'll take any questions or comments. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Vlad. Great talk. And yeah, just as Vlad said, we'll transition to questions now. Just a reminder to the audience, You can virtually raise your hand and I can unmute you to let you talk, or you are welcome to write your question in the chat. So I first had a question for you, Vlad, maybe more so of a clarification question, but when you showed that slide comparing whitebark pine mortality across Glacier National Park and showing what different studies found in comparison to yours, did you sample then like at the same locations as some of those other studies, or was it like general kind of same area roughly?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I actually did not follow the same sampling. I did not sample the same individuals that they did. However, I did use the locations of their study sites to find whitebark pine in the park, because the our veg map was like pretty 50-50, hit or miss on accurately predicting whitebark pine stands. And so in order to save ourselves a lot of time in finding the trees, we did kind of like follow the general locations. But no, we didn't follow the same study protocol or locations.
Great, thanks. Let's see, I'm looking at the chat, and I think, so one question, and this was when you were talking about, I think your chapter 3 of the Clark's Nutcracker, is if whether the plots were randomly selected. I guess that's the first question of it.
I guess I'm not understanding, were they randomly selected from whitebark pine communities, or were Nutcracker point counts plots randomly selected from the plots, from this whitebark plots?
I think it was in reference to the Clark's Nutcracker. Yeah, for those plots.
Yeah, so we surveyed for nutcrackers at all 30 of our whitebark pine habitat assessment plots.
Okay. And then kind of like a follow-up question for that is, were cones present at all plots all years? What was the range of cone density?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, cones were not present at all plots in all years. We definitely had some zeros, particularly in 2022. That was a pretty low cone year for us. I don't have the range off the top of my head, but I can follow up with you, Taza, on that.
Great. And then kind of have a two-part question next. It says, you mentioned 25% test subject nutcracker mortality. Any thoughts on if this is a natural rate of attrition, of perhaps a result of the study's design? So I guess I'll just say the first part for now.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't speak to the natural rate of attrition. I don't know the answer to that. I do think, at least in one circumstance, was an issue with how the transmitter was attached to the bird. We later saw it kind of struggling with the Teflon straps that hold the transmitter on its back. And so I can say with high confidence that that bird died as a result of our doing, unfortunately. And then the other bird that died, I found a year later just by honing in on its signal. And all that was left of that individual was a wing and a bill. And so I can't speak to the cause of death for that one.
And then the second part was, secondly, could you speak a bit more about the idea of nutcrackers shifting from mutualist to parasite?
Yeah, so basically nutcrackers rely on whitebark pine for food, and from what they cache, typically the excess is what then becomes the next generation of whitebark pine seedlings. And so in places where the whitebark pine are so diminished by be it blister rust or other stressors, the nutcrackers can simply consume all of those seeds and not leave any to regenerate later on, and thus becoming a parasite instead of a mutualist.
Great, thanks. Another question is, what alternate cone sources are available in this region? Would you expect different results in an area with better production of other conifers, such as ponderosa pine? In some regions, nutcrackers appear to forage predominantly on other conifer seeds, and this may impact the relationship with whitebark pine, correct? And then last part question is whether or not your thesis will be available in print for other folks to read.
Yeah, let me start one at a time. So yeah, for alternate cone sources available in the region, we do have some ponderosa pine, which seems to be an important source of food for nutcrackers kind of in other parts of Montana. However, in Glacier, it's a pretty low abundance of ponderosa. There's a lot of lodgepole, but again, that's not the best source of energy for these birds. There is Doug fir, a decent amount of Doug fir in those mid elevations. So I would guess that that would be the primary alternative food source. And then we do have a little bit of limber pine as well, but not that much. And then, yeah, I would expect different results in those areas, in those other areas, especially for birds who are more used to feeding on other species seeds.
Another question was if there are any red squirrels in the whitebark pine stands kind of competing for seeds.
Yes, definitely. There are red squirrels in Glacier, and they definitely compete with nutcrackers for seeds. And actually, it's really interesting. When I was reviewing some of our audio, it sounds like the nutcrackers and red squirrels are battling each other at some of those sites. And yeah, so that is the primary competitor, I think, of nutcrackers for whitebark pine.
Are there any other questions? I don't see any other ones in the chat right now. Okay, I think that wraps up.
Oh, I see another question here from Diana. She asked if if we found nutcrackers in Doug fir, because they did in Rocky Mountain National Park when Doug fir cones were high. Diana, we did not look in Doug fir stands. We were specifically curious on how this relationship was affecting whitebark pine. So that's definitely something to keep in mind for the future.
Okay, don't think there are any more questions. Well, thanks again, Vlad, for a great talk, and thanks to the audience for participating. Our next and last webinar of this year's series will be on May 16th, where Katie Nicolato will be presenting on how unmanned aerial systems and hiking surveys quantify whitebark pine in Oregon strawberry mountains. So thanks again, everyone, for attending, and hope to see you next month.
Thank you.